So absolutely delighted that you have all joined us. It's a very terrific day for us to be launching this guidance report, Improving Literacy in Secondary Schools, and to bring together a few voices to share some insights about this report and how it plays out for schools. So we're going to introduce you to the panel shortly, but first we're just going to dive into a little bit of the content that sits behind this guidance report and the evidence as well. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I'm joining you from, the land of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to extend that acknowledgement and respect to the lands on which you're joining us from. We'd like to pay respect to elders past, present, and of course emerging from all of those lands across Australia and internationally. So tonight, we've got a few things to cover. We're going to look at the overview of the recommendations that have appeared in the most recent guidance report. We'll look at some of the global research examples of how these recommendations have been translated into the classroom and adoption of these whole school approaches as well. And for the most part, we'll do that through a conversation with our speakers, Mark and Kate, which Tanya Vaughan will ably host this afternoon. So this is our introduction to this very first report for secondary dedicated guidance. So Improving Literacy in Secondary Schools completes our suite of guidance reports on literacy. Follows on from the two earlier reports which we released about 6 weeks ago now, and delighted to be able to provide this. It takes quite a different tact from the primary reports and certainly builds on, so we would expect that secondary teachers will also be diving into some of the work, particularly that happens in upper primary. Based on global evidence synthesis that have come out of the UK, our partner in the Education Foundation. Sorry, we're just having some sound issues, but hopefully you can hear me now. Great, thank you very much. So just saying that the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK are our partner in this work. They've launched this report previously and we've done the updating for an Australian audience, ably supported by Kate, who is on the line, and we're incredibly grateful for the work and insights that she's brought to this particular report. So we're going to have a look at a little bit of what sits underneath this in the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. Tanya Vaughan is the leader of this work at Evidence for Learning, and she'll be able to talk to some of these things as the discussion goes on tonight. These three approaches that we've put in front of you are the three strands of the toolkit, the three approaches which relate most directly to literacy. Of course, there are others, so you'll be familiar with metacognition and self-regulation, for example, but these are the three that are particularly relevant. They've got some really interesting learnings, particularly when we're looking from a secondary lens. So we are, when we're looking at oral language interventions and phonics particularly, we know that there's an exceptionally strong outcome for younger students. This does flow through when we're talking about students who might have additional vulnerabilities in secondary settings, or for students who are not native English speakers in Australian schools as well. So with that lens, we consider these things. One of the strategies that is probably most familiar for secondary settings is our reading comprehension strategy. This looks very familiar as you walk through a secondary classroom and can take many forms as well. The three of these things, these three approaches, have got some commonalities, and you'll see those on the screen. So when we talk about the approaches in the toolkit, we use three icons to represent the average cost, evidence security, and also months of impact, which is a translation from effect size. When we're looking at costs for these approaches, we're looking at very low cost when we look at a classroom, 25 students on average. So anything below $80 really for these three approaches per student per year is the cost that we're exploring. You can see more details about those costs as you dive into the toolkit as well. The next commonality for these particular approaches is the evidence security. We're confident, very confident in the research that sits below these three approaches. They've been extensively studied, particularly in the US and the UK, and growing assessments happening in Australia as well, although we've still got work to do in that space. The very last icon you'll see there is a plus symbol with months, and this is our impact translation of effect size. Again, these are three approaches that are very impactful, but again, come with the lens that for secondary students, we might not see this particular strength in outcome. I want to talk to some of the recommendations that appear in these in the new guidance report. One, because reading comprehension does flow through into a lot of these things, and you'll see that in particularly recommendation 7, that's where we would often see phonics and oral language interventions occurring as well. So these definitely tie through. But the one that I wanted to draw your attention to, and these are available on the website now as of this morning, is the very first recommendation, which is prioritising disciplinary literacy across the curriculum. So in behind this particular recommendation is building an understanding that while not every teacher is an English teacher at secondary school, every teacher is a literacy teacher. And there is very specific and important reasons to be prioritising the literacy that is specific to your subject and to your discipline. We're going to hear a lot about that tonight from Mark, Kate and Tanya as well, so we won't go into too much detail now. You'll see that the others flow on from that, but this is really an approach that is something that needs to be considered at a school-wide level and something which leadership teams need to support. So we're not expecting teachers coming into a school to be wearing this on their own. It's definitely a shared effort in schools and requires for a lot of secondary teachers quite a bit of additional professional development. I know that you'll hear from a number of secondary teachers tonight, but my own experience in secondary is certainly that I had missed quite a bit of the development that I needed to effectively teach literacy to secondary students. So I'm going to leave the sort of theory here. We're not going to completely diverge from it because you'll hear a little bit more too, but I'd like to now introduce to you our panel. I'm going to just introduce Tanya to you to formally introduce our guests tonight. But Tanya, you will know if you've been to one of our Evidence for Learning webinars before. She leads our work in the Teaching and Learning Toolkit and comes with an incredible background of both working in schools and at a number of levels in the education sphere. So Tanya, I'm going to hand across to you, and I will now be disappearing into the chat box to answer as many questions as I can get to with Pauline. But please welcome our...
Thank you very much, Susanna, and it is so exciting to have this report released, and even more exciting for me is the calibre of the panellists that we have here with us tonight, which I'm about to introduce. Just fantastic to have on board such strong both academic and practitioner voice from Kate, and practitioner and academic voice from Mark as well. So super excited to have you both here. So I'll start off by introducing Kate. So Dr. Kate Braun is a senior lecturer in inclusion and disability at the Faculty of Education at Monash University. She is taught at senior secondary school and higher education for 2 decades, which is most impressive, Kate. In her academic work, she's really been focused in on developing inclusive education courses for both Masters in Teaching as well as Masters in Education at Monash University, and that would be the Clayton campus, where myself was a student in my first degree in science. Sorry, a little bit of add on there. It's a lovely, lovely place to study. All right, Kate's research focuses in on inclusive education at the policy and practice level, examining system, school and classroom practices, all supported by evidence that promote quality and equity for all students. And Kate has really had a specific focus on supporting those students with disability. She has worked at the Commonwealth, state, and also with the Catholic education departments on a number of different projects. She regularly provides professional learning to teachers, and she writes for both academics as well as readers from the general public. And she is also co-convener of the Inclusive Education Special Interest Group at the Australian Association of Research in Education. Very warm welcome for you here, Kate, and thank you so much for joining us and bringing your extensive experience, not just from academia, but also from the practical perspective.
Such a delight to be here. Thanks, Tanya. Pleasure
is all ours and the audience from across the world, including Portugal. I was quite excited. I was reading the chat box. All right, now, Mark. Mark is a certified lead teacher who teaches both English and drama at Guggalan College Senior School in Canberra. Mark's interests include a passion for visual and digital literacies and integrating multimodal text in senior education classrooms. Most excitedly for me, he's used video games as texts with Year 12 students for several years, and he says that has met with some success in some cases. Mark has shared his practice at AATE, ALEA and VATE and ETA conferences in 2017. That was my acronym challenge and I rose to it. And during this year, during the online learning period, Mark has successfully moved and coordinated the development of structured literacy activities for years 11 and 12. Whew. And we're going to send a link to that work that Mark has done at the end of this. Teacher mentoring and professional development is another one of Mark's area of focus and interest. And he's recently completed, and this would have been so much fun, a Masters of Evidence-Based Teaching at the University of Melbourne. And he's a member of the steering committee at AITSL's Highly Accomplished and Lead Teacher Network. So very warm welcome to you tonight, Mark, and thank you for coming along and bringing all your expertise.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me, and good job with the acronyms and Gungahlin. That was pretty close. That was good.
Gungahlin, yeah. I've been practicing. I got there in the end. Beautiful. Well, first we're going to start off and just talk a little bit about the context that you're coming from here tonight. So Kate, you've had a number of roles, some of which we heard about in your bio just before, some of which we didn't. Can you tell us about how your experiences and how this has led you to your current role at Monash?
So I was a teacher for 10 years in a large outer suburban public high school in Melbourne in a relatively disadvantaged area. And like many teachers in training, I actually worked as a classroom teaching assistant while I was completing my training. And then I became a high school English teacher. And while I sort of thought I was going to be swanning into classrooms and discussing fine literature with, you know, near adults, I was enormously surprised to discover that my classrooms actually contained students who were nowhere near ready to have those conversations. And I had a lot of students who couldn't read, or at least couldn't functionally read. And nobody had trained me for that. I was trained to, you know, teach them how to do textual analysis and those kinds of skills. And I was actually really, really cross because I felt the urgency of these kids' futures in my hands. And so that drove me off to find like-minded colleagues and find out what we could do about it. And there began an incredible adventure in Melbourne, where my school went on this journey to do a lot of the things that are actually recommended in this guidance report way before this stuff existed. This was when all those national reading panels were happening. And so we set up literacy interventions for high school students, and I got trained in how to run those, and we ran support programs, and I felt an absolute passion for the work. But there were kids that we were never able to support. So that sent me off on my further higher learning degrees and led me eventually to here where I am at Monash now, looking at what are the most rigorously evidence-based practices that we can use to make sure every student in our classroom is really learning and effectively and has a bright future ahead of them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing your passion and your background. And I think that's really interesting that it started, you know, with integrate aid work or teaching assistants, as they're known variously throughout Australia, and then has led to this deeper passion to really understand what are the best evidence-based practices we can bring to help the full range of students. Thank you. Now, Mark, so you're joining us as a lead teacher from Gungahlin College in Canberra. You also play a number of different roles as well across the sector, including involvement in the Eidsel Holt network. Just wondering if you could share a bit of background about your current context and how that has led to a focus in on literacy there.
Yeah, great. So for those of you who don't know, I'm in Canberra, which is the nation's great capital, and the system here is a little bit different to a few others. We don't do the standard end of course exams. We do consistent assessment through year 11 and 12, and that's what goes towards the final year 12 score that gets them through into university if that's the way they're going. So students generally in the north end of Canberra, where I am, go to a P through 10 school. So they go through their primary and then secondary high school in a single location. And then after that, they go to what we call college. And the college system is just year 11 and 12. So I've got around 1,200 students at my school, just with year 11 and 12. So it's quite a large group,
That's
very
a lot.
diverse. One of the interesting things about Canberra is that the social dynamics are fairly consistent across the whole of the city. So we have no specifics, well, very few specific suburbs that are majority disadvantaged or incredibly well advantaged. It's all a bit of a melting pot of all sorts. And for the most part, our schools reflect that. So all of our classes are going to have a bit of a mix of high achieving, strong literacy skills and lower achieving, low literacy skills. That's a really interesting problem, but at the same time, we're very fortunate to be in that situation, in a lot of situations. So primarily I'm an English teacher, that's my passion. I love teaching drama as well, but English is where my passion has just overtaken my life in the last few years, which is great. And as you mentioned, I'm an accredited lead teacher as well through Eidsel. So part of my role with that as being a lead teacher is assisting my colleagues across my school and other schools in developing pretty much any way they need help developing. I just love doing all that kind of stuff. So literacy here in my specific context at the college, because it's not all weighted on that one final end of year 12 exam, like a lot of other jurisdictions are, because it's continuous assessment, we need to be pushing a lot of the literacy consistently because they, from day dot, are being assessed. So what they do at the start of year 11 contributes significantly to their end of year 12. So it's really important that we give them the groundwork for what they need over the next 2 years, rather than slowly drip feeding them, as can happen sometimes. As it so happens, it's actually the week of the final core skills exam, the Canberra's scaling test. So it's the big one for year 12s today. It's a general knowledge. And the really interesting thing is, because it's a general knowledge, it covers the whole curriculum. So even though students might not study biology, there are questions about biology on the exam. Even though they might not study music, there are questions about music on the exam. So it's actually runs the whole gamut. So we actually need our students to learn their expertise as best as possible. But we also need them to understand the literary cues so that they can work out from context what is happening in the questions that they may not necessarily understand.
I like that biology is included, because I'm a biology teacher, so that's pretty exciting. So that's good to hear, and also arts as well. But it's all subjects. But you just mentioned two of my favourites.
Good.
So well done to you, Mark. But both of those contexts that you've presented, what I like there, I can see commonalities in that you've both been presented in circumstances with students that had a challengingly low level of literacy, and I think that can be very confronting, and how best to work with that. Within our guidance report, we're building off a foundation of general literacy and really an understanding of then how can that be applied to all disciplines. So then, Kate, in bringing your experience from both as a practitioner and both as an academic, how do you think we can broaden the scope for all teachers in secondary school to perceive themselves as literacy teachers, myself included as a science teacher?
I think there's so many sort of prongs to how we need to address this. And one of them is, for academics like me, it's how we prepare teachers to make sure that that's embedded in how we do it. I know I wasn't prepared to do it. I had no idea what the literacy demands in my subject were. And I know that many of my colleagues didn't as well. So there was a perception that those kids that you were referring to that had, really extremely low skills in literacy, there was an assumption that they needed extra English. But if they went to extra English, all they'd have done is read more novels and poems and watch more films and try to write essays about them, and that wouldn't have helped them in the slightest. And so we need really good pre-service, initial teacher education, and we need really high quality in-service teacher education. And we need guidance reports like this. I read this guidance report with this little pang, wishing I could jump in the TARDIS and go back to all those really disadvantaged students that I taught to help their teachers know what to do. Teachers are good people. They've gone into the profession wanting to make a difference in young people's lives. And so if they know what the disciplinary literacy demands are in their subject, they will then have a really good basis on which to teach them. So we really need to grow that knowledge base in the workforce and challenge that perception that it's the English teacher's job to fix it. I know that when I used to pull kids out of class when I was teaching to take them for literacy intervention, they used to get an hour a day, every day of the week for 2 years, those kids. But that meant that we had to pull them out of a subject every day. And there used to be this sense of anger from teachers that I was somehow cannibalising their subject for my own. And they'd say, this kid, they thrive in my subjects, PE or, food tech or whatever it was. Why are you taking them when they're succeeding here? And I'd say this is front-end loading for their future. We can't give them the future they deserve if they can't read the materials in your classroom. And, it's really important that everybody's on board, that from the leadership to every teacher, to understanding the impact that can have.
Thanks, Kate. You've really emphasised there, I think, the need for us all to, as secondary educators, to really focus in on literacy, and then to be open as well in recognising if we do have students that need additional help, and that can be provided, then to be open to that as in different subjects, so that them being taken out of our classes. Because as you say, I mean, without literacy, we really are not going to thrive in the world, and that's what we're really looking for our students to thrive, not just to survive. And that's the joy of education, really, isn't it? That's why we got into it. So thank you. Now, Mark, what about you? How does this play out for you at your school in terms of helping everyone to see themselves as a teacher of literacy?
Well, I imagine it's probably just as scary for some teachers as when they tell me as an English teacher that I'm also a teacher of numeracy. I am afraid I'm a walking example and stereotype of a drama and English teacher. Once I run out of my 10 fingers, I'm not a good role model for maths. But yeah, it's a really good question, because we've got, and I guess it's the case in all secondary situations, but in our situation in particular, because we have to have a focus on literacy. It's really, really important that each student going on to university through our courses, and those who are not, understand the meta language of the courses they're studying, and have a good understanding of how they can identify what language is used for what kind of purpose. I thought that was really one of the really interesting things in the report, is the focus on etymology and morphology, no matter what discipline you're doing. And that reminds me of a couple of conversations I was having lately. A colleague of mine was explaining his PE teacher when he was in high school, because this is our experience, of course, trying to explain to him, playing tennis, you have to follow through, And him being much like me, not greatly adept at physical endeavors, what does follow through actually mean? Showing and practicing doesn't necessarily help, but if you were to break down the language for somebody like my friend, that probably would have been really effective at helping him to understand what follow through meant. And so we come to a situation here, and this is kind of touching on some of the stuff we're going to discuss next. For example, some of our science teachers are really aware of the fact that their students need to understand the language, and the best way to learn that is in context. And this is something that's repeated in the report as well, that it's really important that you're looking at the work, you're speaking with the words, you're writing with the words, you're reading words, and just practicing. And I think that's something that Dr. Kate will discuss as well a little bit later. And that kind of comes to the point of, what is the purpose of what we're teaching the kids? Why do they need this language and this skill? Hopefully it's for some real world purpose. And if we can tap into that and make them recognize that this is valuable, not just within this particular silo of this course, but across all of your studies, then that's something that they will understand, hopefully, is going to benefit them in the long run.
No, exactly. And it's really being able to understand, isn't it, as a secondary teacher in a different subject area, just the importance of your subject-specific language. And as you were talking about in that example before, is that different words and different colloquialisms can have different meanings, and thus you're passing on misconceptions to the students if you're not explicitly being a teacher of literacy in your subject area. So I probably look back and I wonder what my students would say in that regard. I know I could have been a lot more explicit in something like biology. There is plenty of opportunity for that. So if I could jump in a DeLorean, because TARDIS is good as well, but DeLorean for me, and go back, I would also read that guidance report and be a lot more explicit in my teaching, and especially, you know, learning the breakdown of the different words and what's involved. And then they can learn that from moving forward when they hit university biology, when you're hit with that wall of words, which is joyful. I loved it, but not for everyone. All right, so really we're saying everyone is a teacher of literacy, and we really need to embrace that. So building on that, how do you think we can build support for teachers that are in different subjects? So Kate, how can we encourage teachers like myself, so a science teacher, how can we encourage them to have the confidence to really tackle literacy within their subject expertise? And what are some of the high impact strategies that we know work across disciplines?
Okay, so this is my happy place talking about this stuff. So I teach the courses in the Inclusive Education Masters now, where experienced teachers come back to do further education, and I get everybody from, you know, the VCE physics teachers to the early childhood educators. And I have great news for them, that the evidence-based pedagogies that they can use for this really cut across all levels of schooling and all subject areas. The content area doesn't. So like I said before, we need good professional learning for them to get to know that the literacy demands of their own field. But the kinds of, the ways in which we teach are pretty common. So you talked before about teaching explicitly, and explicit instruction is absolutely key and where it needs to begin. Very clear evidence to show that teaching explicitly advantages the largest number of students in the classroom in comparison to those more implicit teaching approaches where people kind of feel as if students will pick it up by being immersed in it. And while some will, we know that a significant number won't. And those students will often end up with really underachieving. So teaching explicitly at the beginning and modelling, there's really good evidence around modelling, but in particular in relation to interacting with texts, one of the most important things that teachers can do is then provide students with highly structured peer and group interactions to engage with that content and to rehearse those skills. A lot of the teachers online here, I think, will be familiar with the term gradual release of responsibility. So after the teacher's done all of that explicit teaching and then modelling it, doing a little bit of I'll do it, you watch, I'll do it, you help, then the students do and the teacher helps, and the students help each other in structured peer learning and structured cooperative learning activities, where they're actually getting multiple opportunities to respond and immediate feedback from each other, and the teacher is supporting. I've got a vivid memory of providing professional learning in a school to the English and maths teachers. And the head of sort of learning support, who was actually a former science teacher, Tanya, you'll be delighted to know she was a biologist. She was facilitating the session, and she was sort of sitting quietly in the corner, really thinking that her job was to just sit there. And then she started to sort of straighten up as I was teaching them about reciprocal teaching, which is a version of highly structured group work where you explicitly teach the strategies that good readers use, and the students get multiple opportunities to rehearse and perfect them. And I was teaching this to the middle school English teachers, but she said, I can do this in my year 11 psychology class tomorrow. And I said, yes, you can. This is something that everybody can be doing across the curriculum. And early childhood educators can adapt that to the, you know, early literacy skills that they're teaching with the littlies that they have with them. So explicit teaching, cooperative and peer learning, and formative assessment, giving students ongoing timely feedback about how they're going achieving those skills, are beneficial for everybody. Tanya, we can't hear you.
And I said that was beautiful, Kate. I love the depth and the breadth that you've covered there in the pedagogies. And just really focusing in on explicit instruction, then focusing in on peer tutoring as well. Also focusing in on formative assessment, ongoing. I love the engagement that the biology teacher was a biologist previously, because that's me as well. So just hit on so many great things, Kate. Now over to you, Mark. What do you think? And I'm pointing to your box. I might do that. What do you think in regards to your school? How can you make sure that, because it's hard, because if you say literacy is everyone's responsibility, then whose responsibility is it for all teachers to be skilled up in literacy across their subject domains? How do you manage that in the real world of day-to-day teaching?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly when you've already got 100 other projects that you're working on, and what are you going to privilege? Because anything that you want to work within a school, the leadership has to support by giving it time, money, and staffing. And that's difficult. So yeah, it's one of those competing priorities, I guess. So I guess it comes down to, from my experience and what I've seen, teacher capacity. And if teachers are taught, and this is something that popped up in the chat box a little earlier, if teachers are given more confidence in how to do the disciplinary literacy themselves, then they will feel more confident to practice it in their own practice. And it's surprisingly, I mean, I say this as an English teacher, but it's surprisingly easy to do some of this. I know that in Canberra, practitioners like Misty O'Donoghue, who is a venerable associate professor from the University of Canberra, who's been doing a lot of consulting work lately, she pushes a lot of very effective literacy programs, which is very much detailed into going into specifics of chunks of meaning. So looking at the sentence and then breaking it up into chunks where you work out what are these couple of words doing? Okay, how does that impact the next couple of words, and so on and so forth. And it's incredibly intimidating, even as an English teacher, the first time you do it. And I only just learned this maybe last year, this particular method. But it's really empowering for the students to be given that as a technique. And the benefit of that is it doesn't just apply to English. It's something that you can do with any course area. And that's really, really valuable, because once the teachers feel more confident in that, then they can use that in their classroom with real world valid texts, not just a textbook, but let's actually go and have a look at a research paper. Let's see how it's written. Let's look at the kind of language that scientists, that mathematicians use to communicate their findings. And that's why Alan Alda created his Institute for Communication of Science, because it's combating the stereotype of the scientist that can't communicate clearly to the average person. And that's really, really valuable. Clear communication is so valuable. So if we can get all of our teachers to really understand the value of the language they use in their domain, to speak the language, to, as Dr. Kate pointed out, really clearly explain what it means and why it's used for this purpose, then I think that we'll see some benefits. I hope. Certainly it's what some of the report recommendations are, so fingers crossed. But it's really important to use those valid, valuable real-world texts. I think that is what you would experience in the real world.
And that's something that I like that Dr. Kate highlighted just before as well. And that is something actually that I did do in my teaching, was give my students papers that I'd written. They were developing their own research projects, so that they were reading real research papers in order to develop methodologies that they would use for a 6-week investigative project. It's one of my fond highlights. And just think about increased scientific literacy in the world right now. How much would that benefit for everyone?
Yeah.
A,
and it doesn't
we know what a virus is.
to...
B, we know how it spreads.
Yep.
There's a lot of conspiracies that are
take
just...
this to our outdoor education courses, to our physical health courses, where we can very explicitly look at health documentation and explanations of particular activities, and we can look at, okay, why do we use this kind of language this way in this domain, but we don't use it that way in a different domain? What is it that changes? And we can help the students become really active readers to recognize, okay, I need to be in this mindset for this particular part.
And it's those small nuances that really are so important in engaging professionally for your life, really, isn't it? And that's something, and that's something that
really
no, and that's something that if you've come from a background surrounded by disadvantage, those are the small nuances that you might not have been explicitly taught. And I think through combining with explicit instruction with authentic texts, just sounds, well, it sounds beautifully exciting as a student that
Well,
my son will be heading into soon.
I guess it connects to John Hattie's Visible Learning program as well, because like in English in particular, it's another course where the students don't necessarily recognise that they're drilling what they're working through in class. They don't necessarily see how that's increasing their skills. They can in other courses, but in English, it's a little bit more ephemeral sometimes. So being able to make that really, really clear for them, I think, would be very empowering for them too.
Definitely real life, link it to where they exist right now. That's why I'm quite excited about your video games, but that's for another day. So building on from that, we've recognised that we know that we've got a wide range of students. Mark, you were talking in your context that in Canberra there's a wide range in every suburb in across Australia. Sometimes there are discrete pockets, although sometimes we have a mix as well depending on the suburb. So how, and I'll start off with you, Mark, and I'll invite you both to talk to this, but just thinking about how is it that we can reach those students, say, that are coming to us with really high literacy skills beginning, and then those that are coming to us with lower literacy skills. How is it that we can cater to all those needs? And that's the really difficult question of teaching, isn't it? And then I'll hand over to you, Kate, on that same question.
So I think one benefit of using real world text and going through and breaking it down means that you don't need to identify the low achieving students and say, look, you guys are operating a couple of years behind your peers. I need to give you I hate to say a phrase, but a dumbed down text. You can say, okay, here's the text, let's work with it. Let's scaffold it and let's work together to decipher what it's saying. The higher achieving kids may well run ahead, and we can support that and we can scaffold them and give them extension activities. But it's the lower achieving students I'm usually a little bit more passionate about getting in and trying to work out how can we help pick you up to where we would like you to be and to where you would like to be. So using the real world texts that the kids recognise and respect, we're not giving them the cat in the hat and they don't, I'm a dummy, I'm doing this book and everybody else is doing the smart book. We're kind of talking up to them and talking them up as well. So hopefully building some of that confidence. I had another note written down that I wanted to discuss, but I can't find it and I've forgotten what it was. It'll come back to me.
It'll come back.
Yes. High expectations and learning goals. Absolutely, Robin. That's a really, really, the lower you set the bar, the more they won't be bothered trying to reach it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it, trying to get all, but I think with authentic tasks and authentic texts, then scaffolding that is a real way forward. What about you, Kate? How would you see the best way to support students of diverse learning needs?
So how long have I got, Tanya? Because I could...
I wish we had the whole night, Kate, but we've got, you know, take a bit of time on it. I think it's incredibly important for Australia and the world to focus in on. So take a bit of time on it and we can always shuffle other questions.
All right, I'll try to be as concise as I can and cram as much in as I can. The first thing that I want to do is talk about this idea of low achieving learners, because that's just an idea. It's not actually a thing. Students' performance is really fluid. Students can be high attaining in one area and not another, and that can even be within a particular subject. And so we need to understand that this idea that students are low attaining is fluid and that we can change it. So it becomes about, you know, Mark talked about making sure that you're maintaining connection with the age-appropriate curriculum content and having high expectations for all students. Now, that doesn't mean you expect every student to get an A+ at the same achievement standard, but having high expectations for every student is absolutely crucial. So if you've got students who haven't been performing well at school, you need to have a two-pronged attack. And one of those is, what are you doing for them today to make sure they can access the curriculum and participate in the classroom and learn something? And what are you doing for them tomorrow to make sure that you can address what has perhaps sat beneath the reasons why they may have been achieving poor results in particular areas at school. There are a number of things that schools have historically done that we now know can actually produce perverse outcomes. So one of them is to organise students into groups according to their previous attainment. We know that that's actually led to a culture of low expectations for the students placed in the so-called lower groups. And we know two interesting things about that. One of them is that it hasn't actually advantaged the other students in any significant or meaningful way. And the other is that where there have been small portions of advantage for those other students, it's come at the expense of the lower achieving students. It's actually been like, you know, stealing from one group to give to another, which is counter to everything that we went into teaching for. We didn't go into it to sort of, you know, take from one group to give to another. So it's really, really critical that we find equitable ways to make sure everybody's getting access to that high quality learning. So one of them is organisational, keeping the classrooms mixed ability. And while many teachers didn't go through school in those, and they often feel confronted by the idea, it's actually key. All of those evidence-based practices like peer learning and cooperative learning actually the magic happens if you've got a mixed ability classroom. You don't get the outcomes if you don't have that mixed ability cohort in front of you. So making sure we don't organise the students into groups that become streaming and achieve those perverse outcomes. Another is the use of classroom assistants, which I once was. And I've worked with some amazing classroom assistants, and there's really incredible evidence, I believe, on your website, Tanya, that shows ways that
Correct.
and deploy those teaching assistants in the classroom to make sure that everybody's getting access. So access for today, for students who may have very poor literacy skills, can be achieved using universal design principles, making sure that the way we present information to students is accessible, that it's not always in blocks of very small print with long words, which may be really difficult for students with all sorts of challenges to access. But it's also about providing intensive, explicit and targeted teaching to those students to address underperformance at school. And I saw somebody ask this question in the chat box before. So I just wanted to make really clear for, I believe it was Robert, that schools need to be monitoring how students are progressing and quickly intervening in a timely manner. So if you've got students who aren't reading well, then you need to get them reading well. You can teach every kid to read. I've never met a kid I couldn't teach to read. And I ran reading intervention for some students with some really significant disabilities and challenges in their personal lives. So like I said, it's about what you do today to facilitate access and participation, and it's about what you're doing to make sure that they're making progress tomorrow.
Having trouble with my mute button, aren't I? What I really loved there was thinking about today and tomorrow and the concepts that you're thinking there, and you're thinking about, okay, well, let's engage them in authentic real tasks today, but let's scaffold that. But then let's also think maybe they need some extra intervention based on what they haven't learnt in the past. And I think that's, you know, what we need to do for all our students, and of course, the Teaching and Learning Toolkit 100% supports the fact that we know that setting and streaming does not lead to advantages in learning, especially for those in the lowest quartile and those in the middle as well. So, yeah.
Rather does assigning those children to a teaching assistant who isn't a qualified teacher. You know, and I just wanted to give an illustrative example. When I was teaching a Year 7 student, I noticed he wasn't attending in class, and I discovered that he was carrying his Medicare card in his pocket because he needed it to copy out his name. That was the degree to which he had difficulties in reading and writing at school. Now, we had him within 2 years reading at grade 6 level. It only took 2 years. It took an hour every day of the week for 2 years, but he effectively jumped something like 4.5 grade levels in reading. So it can be done. If the school's prepared to back it and staff it and resource it, then every student can get there.
That's lovely humanisation of what we're talking about in very general terms. Thank you. And, you know, that's exactly what you're saying. And that's why we all got into teaching, is to make a difference to those students most in need. I think what we'll do now is we'll focus in on just some key takeaways that you would like to leave the audience with. I might start off with you, Mark, and then we'll finish off with you, Kate. So what are some key, do you think, evidence-based literacy approaches at the secondary level that you want the audience to leave with today?
So I think that it's important to looking at your disciplinary literacy, and so it doesn't matter what course you teach, what is the key language that you use, that you're using on a regular basis, and to explicitly, as Kate pointed out, explicitly explain how it works and model that in use, but do it with valuable and valid activities where you're actually reading, writing, and speaking with those words constantly. Reciprocal reading is another really, really useful technique. Once you've read a passage, guide the students through creating their own questions, which they can ask one another to help them engage on a more deep level actively with the text. Sometimes if it's not structured carefully, they could just spend the whole time reading it, looking for what might be a good gotcha question to ask, but that's not really the point of it. But yeah, if you structure reciprocal questioning, reciprocal reading really well, I found that it helps my students become a little bit more interested because they become the teacher to a degree, particularly with thematic studies in English. But again, if I look at, from a drama perspective, with my drama hat on, if I'm looking at an activity talking about a generic dead practitioner, then I can get them to read some of his work and they can explain what is he trying to say here. Or they can ask each other, what is he trying to say? Where does that come from? What biases might he have? So on and so forth.
Fantastic. So really, I like that they become the teacher, and that's really tapping into metacognition and that's what gradual release is all about, really, isn't it? We model the behaviours that we would like to see within our students, and then we release them to that so that they can
absolutely
run it themselves. That's the whole idea. We're trying to create adults here, aren't we?
Well, trying. What do we call them? The 21st century skills. I know we're 20 years in.
I know, but we still call them.
Yep.
We still call them the 21st century skills. Those skills that we need for thriving. And Kate, what about you? How do you think? What are some key takeaways you'd like the audience to take with you tonight?
The key takeaways are, in fact, somebody, I'm afraid I don't know your name anymore, somebody a long time ago in the chat thread asked how on earth do you do this, as well as everything else we're meant to do. And I just wanted to say that, you know, what Mark just talked about is exactly how you do it. By starting with explicitly teaching content and skills, and then giving students structured peer and group activities to do them together in, they're more actively engaged because they have to be. They're not a 28th of the classroom, they're a quarter of the group. They are getting multiple opportunities to respond and engage with the content and the skills. But most importantly, the students who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged at school and whose literacy is poor are getting a huge times more of engagement with the content itself and with their peers. All the evidence from the inclusive education shows that these really evidence-based practices that are supportive for everyone in the classroom are the glue that creates that belonging and social value for children with disabilities who run the risk of leading very separate lives if they're not a valued member of the class and the group like everybody else. So the way you do this, on top of the million other things that you have to do as a teacher, is by doing them in this integrated way, so that you're giving students practice in perfecting and understanding the knowledge and skills together. And if there's a student who isn't progressing in your classroom, it's not that the student is broken. It's that what you're doing hasn't worked, and there's other things to try. I love these toolkits because they give teachers a toolbox of things to try that have a high probability of success. And if you try one and it didn't succeed, that doesn't mean you're a failure as a teacher. It means there's something else in your toolkit that you can try instead, and that you can teach every student. That's my takeaway I'd like everyone to leave with.
Beautiful. And it is so true, isn't it? We often think just because we're saying it means that the students understand and will go from A to B, but if they're not going from A to B, we need to try a different way and try different strategies. And I like the way you really focused in on using peers, thinking about Vygotsky and that, and how important that is in keeping our students all together. And that's really life too, isn't it? We all exist together. And so how can we create a positive microcosm in school and then have that translate to the wider world? That's why we're in education. Fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you for being here for tonight. We're going to do a few close-off slides and then we will finish up for tonight. So these are the up and coming webinars that we have. So tonight, Kate was really talking a lot, and I don't think she knew this was coming up, about teaching assistants. So we're going to have Luke on, who has implemented the effective use of teaching assistants around the evidence base, and then his teaching assistant is going to be on as one of his teaching assistants from his school is going to be on as well in a panel in talking about that, because we know that the effective use of teaching assistants in a whole group situation can really make a big difference to all students. And as Kate was saying, to effectively deploy them can make a big difference if they're deployed for the whole class rather than the least experienced person sometimes with the student that needs the most help. That's definitely not what we're advocating for. Then we'll be have a webinar on student behaviour. So that's going to be a fun one too. And then, we're asking you what you would like us to talk about next year, because we thought we didn't want to run them too close to the end of term, because we know we're all teachers and we know what it gets like at the end of term, especially the end of this year. Can't imagine. These are the different ways you can reach out to us. So if you want to get in touch with us, and we can pass on any questions to the other panelists. We've also prepared within the pack answers to all the questions that you've sent through, with additional resources that we'll send out, and that will be sent out in a week's time, as long with an attendance certificate as well. And then we're on all the socials. All of us are on the socials as well, so you can contact Kate or Mark on the socials. We're on Twitter, and that was tweeted out by us, so we're all there as well. And then we have our e-news as well, which just keeps you up to date with evidence-informed practice across Australia. But I just want to finish off by thanking the panelists so much for sharing their extensive expertise and the way that they bring not just their expertise, but have backed that with evidence in everything that they do within their schools and now in higher education as well. For Kate, thank you so much for coming along tonight and sharing that, and sharing also what we have is a passion for really helping students overcome any disadvantage that they do initially begin with. And every student we can teach, and every student we can help become the best possible outcomes. So thank you so much. And the recording will also be released in a week's time as well. So I'll just say good night and goodbye, and thank you for your precious time as educators from all across the world, including Portugal. Thank you for joining us tonight.